So Jazakumullah khair, thank you so much to all the ISNA folks for hosting us today and having us join you. Barakallah feekum. So inshallah ta'ala, I just want to naturally some of my points intersect with what Dr. Kathy and Ryan had talked about. But inshallah ta'ala, I'm hoping to give a different angle or a different perspective as we continue the conversation. And indeed, this is conversation. We're here to learn from you as much as you might be able to learn from us. One of the things that I wanted to start with, there is a new group actually called the Anti-Hate Network that Amira Gawabi is actually part of, and that is a really multi-faith, multi-sectoral, multi-belief collaborative that focuses on not only reporting on hate in Canada or in a Canadian context, but also in documenting and sharing that information. So most recently in December 14, so about a few days ago, they had released a critique to the public safety report that came out not too long ago. And I'm going to go through some of the critiques that they have shared because these things are important. And Dr. Kathy had touched upon some of the stats, the startling statistics that are coming out in terms of the rise of hate crimes in Canada. So we're not doing better. We might not be doing worse, but we're definitely getting better at reporting and sharing these facts. So one of the things that Dr. Kathy talked about is that from what the report had said, is that anti-Semitism is the most prevalent, or Jewish Canadians are the most prevalent group who experience these hate crimes. But also to add to that, actually it is Muslims that experience the most violent type of this hate. So this hate is being experienced across the board, and I know the brother brought it up, this question around maybe why are we focusing on race or only talking about race and religion? But often those are the two dimensions that hate seems to be concentrated on. So it's on the basis of race and religion. And then we talk about, the interlocking or the intersecting of these systems when both race, religion, gender, sexual orientation or sexuality come all in one place, class. And we have these folks. We probably have Black, Jewish, or Muslim women who are LGBTQ, who have disability, who are, who are homeless. So imagine the life of someone like that, and how many systems of oppressions are acting upon them. So it's important to just note that. So as we talk about this, rising of hate, if I want to put it on quotations, or noticing of more hate. So do you know, how many of you know have heard most recently of the yellow vests? Awesome, okay. So can you tell me a little bit about it, sisters? Just quickly, like one thing that you know about them. Either of you both raised your hands. Or brother. No? Okay, so the yellow vest is basically what the movement in France is being called, right? And it's against the changes that were proposed to raise the prices of the gas. Yeah, totally. I'm like, yeah, go for it. I am obviously for the environment, and I want these changes to happen, but these changes cannot happen in a way that it affects the most marginalized and the people who cannot afford to do this work, without finding ways to support those who are the poorest of the poor amongst our communities. So that's wonderful. Unfortunately, in a Canadian context, there's the Yellow Vest Canada, right? And it's not. That is, social justice is not their aim. It is actually, anti-Muslim, anti-Semite, Islamophobic, anti-Black, anti-immigrant group that calls not only for harm towards those communities, but are being very vocal in terms of violence and harms against politicians, including our Prime Minister. So, you know, sharing very explicitly violent language as well as images that call for, you know, things like the hanging of the Prime Minister and things like that. So I'm going to just do a trigger warning. I'm going to use some of the things that I might share might be really disturbing, and you know, so I just want to share, you know, let you know that in advance. So first of all, this movement of hate is not isolated in one country. It's transnational, it's global, it's building, and people who have these ideas are gravitating towards each other. The social media and the internet is not creating this. It's just providing vehicles and ways that people can get together and talk in very anonymous, secretive ways that then they don't have to actually face people if they were going to say these things face to face. So that's the first thing. The second thing is hate is not something that is no longer, you know, it's not an insinuation. We often talk about microaggressions. Microaggressions is that moment where you think was like, did they just say that? Did I just hear that? Was that because I'm Muslim? Was that because I'm Black? You know, and then it puts you in a place of doubt that you don't really know what you've experienced, if it was real or not, right? And these things are really, because they're continuous and they happen again and again and again, and it creates self-doubt. It really is detrimental to our well-being and mental health, because we question who we are, and we question if we're sane or not, if it's really our fault or not, right? So these things are really bad. But what's worse is macroaggressions, which is when it's actually in your face, when no longer people are scared to tell you these, you know, really hateful things in your face and actually do, you know, commit acts of violence. So there is this group called the 3%ers, which is an Islamophobic anti-immigrant group, Canadian, and it's not only a group; it's actually a militia that is practicing, you know, like target practicing somewhere in the woods. And one of their leaders actually said this in the Yellow Vest Facebook page, and the Anti-Hate Network have a screen capture on their website around this. The only good Muslim is a dead Muslim, right? So imagine a fellow Canadian saying that, actually, and not only saying it in the secret in the basement, but putting it on social media. And it's not a secret of who this is attributed to. So the other thing is, like, so we talked about some of the places. So where is this hate happening? Is it somewhere, like, you know, like, can we pinpoint it? Actually, you know, one of the reports that showed where hate is most being experienced. So yes, congratulations, Thunder Bay is, you know, makes the top, right? So in Ontario, so Thunder Bay definitely, and given especially what we've just heard about, the reports that are coming out around the police brutality, the two reports that just came out a few days ago are around the horrendous treatment of Indigenous people in Thunder Bay. But that seems to be, you know, and Sarnia is the next one. But you know what, it's not that far away. So places like Hamilton and Peterborough or York and Guelph, right, are making the chart as well. So hate is experienced in a higher numbers than 2017. 2016 as opposed to 2017 in all these places. So literally this is in our backyard. We don't have to go as far as Quebec or Montreal or as far as Thunder Bay and Sarnia to experience this hate. So it's important for us to recognize that none of this is isolated. So the theory of the lone wolf has been debunked, right? None of this happens by one person sitting in a basement watching YouTube videos. White supremacy is a system, and I need to call it out. We need to say these words, and we need to say it often. from the use of language and terms. So it's funny because also the systems that we operate in, whether it's in our education system, our social justice system, our political system, believe it or not, they've been created to protect white supremacy, right? It took maybe the past 50 years or so for us to chip away at these systems and to try to change them. But innately, there are structural things in place that haven't been shaken out yet. So it's important for us to know that. These systems were not built initially to be equitable. They were not built for indigenous people. They were not built for black people. They were not built definitely for Muslims and Jewish people and Hindus and Buddhists. They were built for Anglo-Saxon Christian faith to maintain supremacy and European-based lineage. Right? So for us to then try to operate and create equity and justice within these systems, it's going to be challenging and continuously difficult. So the way the system, these systemic racism and systemic Islamophobia are in the forms of things like public safety, not putting any energy towards addressing white supremacist and right-wing groups, right? Putting nothing in their budget towards that. The RCMP, for example, saying that these groups are really not dangerous, right? CSIS closing all of not even opening documentation, not calling what happened in Quebec a terrorist attack, right? It's the language that we use. Calling things like what happened in Toronto the van attack, because the van is the one that attacked the people. Right? So it's very important. We have to be perceptive of how language is being used to protect certain groups. So not naming these things as national security, threat to national security, and threat to Canada as a nation and our foundation and who we are. The other thing is so when you think about these systems and how, for example, anti-black racism happens, in a systemic way. You all know the police report, the Toronto police report that just came out, and showcasing that black community makes 8.8 population of Toronto, and except that 28.8% of police force was used against black people. So how does that work? It's disproportionate use of force, and knowing things like. We all know when things get reported or when things are really, really bad by the time it reaches things like an internal investigation unit. So that being said, pretty grim. Let's go to, now what? Yeah, do we just go put our head down like an ostrich and, say it's doomed and gloomed, khalas, we don't have anything to do. SubhanAllah, that's not the case. We have actually a lot of good to do, right? Because as I said, none of this, we don't have actually the proof that things are getting worse. We just know that we know more and we're all interconnected better. So I'm gonna share a very small story around, and it's one of those things obviously that really is just leaves a mark in our conscious, what happened in Quebec. So on the 28th, when that declaration, the Muslim ban happened in the U.S., I remember staying up all night. I'm part of this Muslim advocacy group, and staying up all night, and we were sharing stories of families and students and people who are stranded in different places, people who are being returned, stories, and literally staying up all night and not being able to get off my Twitter, not being able to get off glued to my phone, and then the shooting happens. As we were all of us talking about this implications to what's happening in the U.S., this happens home. And I've never physically felt ill due to a mental anguish. But I remember the next day, and I think it was a Monday, not being able to go to work, not being able to physically peel myself off the bed, right? Not being able to drive my daughter to work. And this is the physical impact of hate, right? It has a physical impact. It's not only emotional. And then what had allowed me to actually get out of bed is knowing that people I worked with and my friends and my friends on social media and all the activists I knew, there was a protest that was staged, right? There was like people were coming on the streets to show love and support to Muslims. And I remember that weekend, one of I don't know if it was the next day or like it was just very close to it, like one of the biggest rallies of love and care and anti-hate rally happened in Toronto. And it literally had the biggest turnout. And I remember taking my daughter there and just feeling the love and the solidarity, even though it was really cold, but walking around for like a few hours, trying to keep our feet warm once in a while, popping into a Tim Horton. But that was, so that act of getting out of bed and then being in community, seeing people who looked like me and people who didn't look like me out here, supporting each other was really, really important. So what do we do? I'm going to go through a few suggestions, and these are just suggestions. And what Ryan is doing is part of that bigger picture and bigger puzzle. And yes, I agree. If giving hugs is not your thing, that's fine. You know what? That doesn't excuse you from doing something else. There's a lot of other things to do. So you're all walking away with homework, basically. So talk about it. So what we're doing here is part of that conversation. Let's not pretend it's not happening. Name it. Call it out and call it in. Do you guys know what's the call-out culture and call-in culture? Call-out culture? Call-out culture is what happens when we're calling out the U.S. in a lot of the things that they're doing, or we're calling out our current provincial government in a lot of the things they're doing. It's basically publicly, it's almost public shaming, right? Like, so calling out someone and saying, hey, you've done this, it's unacceptable, fix it. So that is very, very important, especially for large organizations, for people in power, for people who we might not have access to immediately. And when the harm is so extensive and overreaching. So that is calling out an act of hate or oppression or discrimination. Calling in, on the other hand, is when we have private conversation. So when we have nasiha in a prophetic way, when we call someone into our space and say, you know what, mashallah, you're an amazing person, but that little thing you said, that thing you did, it won't fly anymore, and it's that space. But you know what, you have to have, first of all, a previous relationship with the person to be able to call them in. And then sometimes there has to be safety within you, so there cannot be power dynamic changes. So I do call in my manager at times, because him and I have built relationship over the past 4 years. So if I sense that something is not 100% right, there is a mechanism. But a lot of us don't have that space at work or in community. So this is what you do outside of the masjid or inside the masjid, right? So create opportunities to either be part of a call-out actions or a call-in, kinder, gentler reminder nudges, like, can we fix this together? Here's some resources, here's what you can read and all that. Educate, so in churches, in masjids, in synagogues, in temples, in other places of worships, the schools, and thank you, Dr. Catherine, for bringing this statistics up, because I had a lot of opportunity to work or to engage with a lot of students over the past few months, and the next generation is amazing. They are just so awesome. Like, they get it. They get these things. So I have a lot of hope about the brilliance of the next generation. But you know what? At the same time, with the changes in our as of I think Friday, there was cuts in the fundings of a lot of before school and after school programs. So if the teachers are not supported to have these non-essential conversation with their students, if all what we're teaching our kids is hard math and science and history that is not applicable to our current status, then unfortunately I don't know how are we going to be educating. So investing in our kids is an important goal. Form or join coalitions. Whether they're unions, organizations, interfaith groups. So either look around, if you can find something, don't reinvent the wheel, join these groups. If they don't exist, make them happen. The fifth point that I want to bring up is policy change. So as much as we want to really rely on the kindness of the hearts of people and in the goodwill of good people, things only move when there is a policy change, when there is consequences, when there are resources that put behind it. So yes, it's time to put our politicians into question, or to put them hold them accountable. Having a multi-party approach is very, very important for us. We cannot only work with parties that we gravitate towards. So those who know me politically know that I'm either center or center-left, or really, really far left. But you know what? Create spaces to work with people on the right, people who are conservatives. Because at the end of the day, you don't want politicians to be left where their base support only becomes right-wing extremists, and that is, they look around and that's who they found next to them. So there is a huge need for us to have this systemic approach. The other thing I wanted to say is also, let's create space and methods to support the victims. So what you did, Ryan, is an example of that. You've seen the victims as, by proxy, or the community who was in Pickering, not in Quebec, but in Pickering, in your own community, and you went out and you created this space of love and support for them, right? So let's look at who is being victimized, and then how can we create space for them to support them, whether it's free hugs or the rings of peace that were formed when this happened around masjids. The campaigns like I Will Ride With You, particularly for Muslim women, visibly Muslim women. Things like people wearing the safety pin to indicate that they are safe, and you can reach out to them if you feel you're in trouble. And the final thing I wanted to talk about was basically making sure that we have ways to heal. That these things are real. These things have both mental, emotional, and physical consequences of experiencing hate and experiencing continuously. So I think I remember listening to Hassan Minhaj one time, and he said, if I sat in front of Fox News for like an hour or 2 hours, I'll hate Muslims, So if you keep on hearing negative stereotype, and I wonder what it's doing to our kids, right? Because I remember having a conversation with my daughter who also wears hijab, saying that, and alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm not typically scared to go out or to do things. I'm like one of those people of like, yeah, I gotta show you, I'm gonna come out. I'm like, you can see from my stature, I'm not a very big person, but in my head, I'm like, 7 feet, like, muscular person. So in my head. So this is the conversation I'm having with my daughter, and she was like, no, mama, it's scary. And I'm like, oh, are you scared? Wearing hijab outside? She was like, yeah, I worry, I look around. And subhanAllah, this is in my house, and I didn't know this. Because some of us are like, have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the protector, don't worry about it. Nothing's going to happen to you. Yes, inshallah, nothing is going to happen to you, and you're supposed to, read all your, du'as and do your prayers and all those beautiful things. But the reality is, there are segments of our communities who are dealing with this consistent fear, and the younger the kids are, sometimes the more vulnerable they might be to feeling this way. So let's be open to have conversations with our kids around this as well. And then, I don't know, do dhikr sessions, or do your prayers, have nature walks and gatherings, whatever might work for you, whether it's crocheting or knitting or painting nights, or things to help you feel better, to help you get connected to nature, to help you feel connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Different people heal differently, but let's create space for that. We cannot always just be the macho community whereby nothing will faze us, because we got this, and alhamdulillah, and the Sahabas had to deal with much more, true, and Muslims in other places have to deal with much more, true, but this is our reality, and this is what we have to deal with, and we have to be open to the emotional vulnerability of our youth as they're growing up. As much as the next generation is fabulous and awesome and brilliant and in touch with their feelings, that means they also need the support systems so they can remain that way, so they can remain vulnerable, so they can remain open, so they can express their feelings when they feel them. So that will be the end of it. Jazakum al khair for listening. Assalamu alaikum.
MashaAllah, Jazakallah khair, Sister Sabia. We've almost come full circle. I think we have, being a community based on oral tradition, based on the stories, based on those narratives, the arts, major and minor, that Sister Kathy was pointing us towards, that really bind us together. It's not enough, to your point, Sister Sami, that we just continue along, come to the masjid, pray your 5 daily prayers, salam, dua, sunnah, leave, to get more involved and to create these spaces for healing and for mutual support. I have a habit of droning on, so I'm going to stop my now. We have a few more minutes before 4 o'clock, and with Brother Taha's permission, maybe we can go a little bit over. I'd invite anyone to have any more questions to maybe take the floor, inshallah. I'm going to start off then. Brother, please, as you make your way. One question that I have for Sister Kathy. Sister Kathy, we've been at this for such a long time now. What do you think some of the constraints are that keep people from actually coming and sharing their stories and self-advocating for themselves? And then, brother, we'll have your question next.
You asked me about constraints on why people aren't coming forward to share their stories, and I can think immediately of two. One of them is some people feel shy about writing. They think they're not a good writer, or they feel basically speechless. Maybe the event was so difficult for them to handle that they don't even know how to put it into words. Those are the times when we need counselling and outside help. Somebody who can help you articulate and walk it through. Sometimes an emotional event is so difficult that you suppress it, you pretend it's not there. So those are for the very, very kind of extreme traumas. I think there's a general shyness about sharing one's, even though human beings, we love to talk about ourselves. You tend to love to talk about yourself, perhaps in certain environments, and you're not sure where this story is going to go. You're not sure how people are going to react to it. You're not sure if it's safe for you to tell it in that way. I know that when we do what's called qualitative research, where we try to gather people for interviews, even though you might promise confidentiality of their story, it's really, really hard to recruit Muslims for social science projects, just because there's often a deep concern about what are you going to do to my story or with my story? Will it be truly honoured in a way that will make me feel dignified? So I think that is a second concern. So the first one was about maybe inability to articulate, and the second one was just a sense of shyness. And I think the third one, of course, I think Muslim cultures stress the sense of privacy, that you don't talk, we have this idea, quote, we don't air our dirty laundry in public. So it's even hard for inside families, people who are struggling. There's this sense, I mean, I'm not socialized into a Muslim culture, but this is what I've learned in my years as a convert, that you don't share with strangers or outsiders what might be going on in the home, because it brings a sense of shame to the family or something. So I think that's also part of it, learning how to tell one's story in a way that still honours and dignifies one's own family. So those are the three things that I would think of.
Jazakallah khair, sister. Brother, you had a question, inshallah.
Yeah, this question is for...
Let me get it turned on, inshallah.
Please, my voice. This question is for Dr. Kathy. This morning I was watching CNN, and Fareed Zakaria was talking about this new phenomenon of right-wing movements in Europe, in other parts of Asia, in the whole world is more or less caught in something what he stated like the Weimar Republic, the rise of Nazis. It's happening in France, it's happening in Italy, it's happening in other parts of the United States. Some of the segments in yesterday's reports from Quebec, and the statement starts coming coming up from yesterday's meeting at the People's Party, the new party that's been formed by the previous member of the Conservative Party. We are seeing these things in our society as well, as Sister Samia has pointed out. So the question I would like to ask Dr. Kathy, what is bringing back this hate that has happened to this world before? From your social science study, since you have studied this, is this something that's economical, that's every time there's a depression, these things come out? Or is it a defect in the human being that hate comes back again and again, despite the consequences that we have seen before? And I'll sit down and take it from there.
It's often said that these cycles of hate are based on economics. I'm less convinced of that as time passes. I think it's now to do with the sense of identity that globalization has caused mass movements of people around the world. And of course we know that contemporary globalization is not actually the first time globalization happened. People have been moving around the world for centuries, but with instant communication and television, the sense of what that means, I think, to people's identity has changed. So that there is a feeling amongst certain groups that their society is being changed by a mass influx of people who aren't from them. I think it's essentially tribalistic. These people are not from my tribe, we don't know who they are, we don't know what they're going to do to us, and they're going to change the meaning of our tribe. So I think it's a deeply rooted human, tribalism has been around since the first human days, right? But I think it's been amplified by globalization. So that's how I would answer that question. This sense that the white society here feels that it's under threat, that it's going to get changed. And I confess, I'm a convert, right? But I'm a white convert, and I grew up in Australia. And you taught, I think it was both Ryan and Sister Samia mentioned these systems of oppression that you learn by just accidentally growing up in your neighborhood. White society, you don't have any non-white neighbors, you go to an all-white school, you go to an all-white high school, you read the white-controlled media, the white-controlled curriculum. You can become racist without even realizing it, without even knowing what that actually means. So, I was going somewhere with that story now, I forget where I was going. Oh yeah, so I can actually remember going to a part of the city, this is in Australia before I came to Canada, where all the signs were in a different language. And you look around and there's like almost no white people walking through the neighborhood, and then you think, oh my God, what are these people doing here in my city? They're taking over, they're changing, and I don't understand their language, I don't know what it means. So you feel excluded from it. And so I think, if I hadn't become Muslim, I might have become a white nationalist. Because I can understand where they're coming from, what that feeling is. I think Samia and Ryan will probably have interesting answers to your question too, so I'd like to pass the mic down.
So I think I'm going to just pick up from the identity piece, and it's kind of interesting, whereby there's this concept that's called white fragility. How many of you have heard about it? A few people in the room? Perfect. So it's the idea of, and it only exists probably here, like in North America, Europe, like where there is a white majority, and historically where white folks have been in power. So it's the idea of not having built resilience through time, and not being, ever feeling othered, or when that has been the norm of always being centered in all conversations where, you know, your food was the best food and your clothes were the best clothes and everybody looked like you and you were never, you know, your authority was never questioned. So you pass through life not recognizing that this is a privilege that you have and it's not something that other people might not have. And often when I have conversations with people that I am training, typically around equity conversations in health or in social justice circles, it's that aha moment of things like having conversations around power and how much power you have, and you walk into a room and kind of size up who else is in that room. And it's often white folks in the room saying, oh, I've never thought about it, right? But it's a privilege to have never thought about it. Because as a black hijab wearing woman, I walk into a space and I bet you, like, I will be looking around to see if there are other racialized people in that room, if there are other women in the room. I will find out who owns most power in that room and where do I stand in comparison to them. And often when I'm walking into these spaces, I am the instructor, I am the trainer, so I hold a lot of power, but it's more positional power than societal power. So I have a temporary, as long as I hold the mic, I have temporary power. And I often tell people that. And I say, yeah, it's my classroom now, I can do whatever I want. but that the realities are different as soon as we step out from this space. So when these changes are happening, and then maybe the white way of wearing clothes is not the best one, or all the scientists are no longer white, and the people who are presenting on TV are not white, then there's this sense of like, oh my God, what's happening? You know, that the world is coming to an end. And then you're like, no, but you know, you've got them for centuries. It's okay, share some of the power, right? But people are not ready to give up any of the power or to share it. And often the conversations that we have, and it's fear, right? Because it's the fear of being replaced, right? So it's often that conversations around having with people and say, no, it's not about replacement, it's about power sharing. And it's the same conversations that we had with men when the women's movements were happening. We're not here to remove you, we just want the same thing as you. So I think it's important to continue that conversation, but often when we don't have those conversations and when we isolate people, and I have a real problem in like just pushing people so far that the only option they have is to be part of these groups and othering them in every other space, right? So it's a difficult place to be in, of like, I want to be kind, I want to be nice, but you messed up.
Ryan?
Thank you very much. And what you were saying, another way I've heard that said, that idea is, why are you afraid of becoming a minority if you're a white person? Minorities are treated badly, are they? And so I mean, and that's something that I know for me, having grown up in Thunder Bay, which is a very monochrome city. Like to the extent that there was one point where, in 2000, I'm 20 at this point, I went down to university, came back, and I'm driving down the road in Thunder Bay called the Harbor Expressway. Has 9 sets of lights on it. I don't know why they call it the expressway when you have to stop every 2 kilometers, bananas. So I'm stopped at this light. There's 2 people in front of me, 1 person on the left. Light turns green. Nobody goes. Why is nobody going? I look around, all the people and all the cars are looking to the left. I look to the left. There's somebody wearing a turban on a street corner. I honk my horn because I want these people to get going, because I'm angry. This is in 2000. This is definitely, it kind of comes back to the idea about ignorance. I feel like when you don't have these experiences with people in different groups, when you don't have these direct relationships, it's so easy to label and dehumanize. When you look at what works really well for media organizations, there's the saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Something that scares you, something that is frightening, something that creates fear, you follow it along, not because you're interested, but because you're worried. What's going to happen next? What's going on? And so the more fear that there is, the more papers are sold, the more attention you have, and it's this kind of arms race. And scared people make really, really bad decisions. This is why people keep watching Fox, and why people keep making stupid decisions after watching Fox News. The more you have that fear coupled with the ignorance, the more these bad things happen. And I feel like that fuels a lot of this. And that's why it's so important to do everything we can to remove that ignorance. Because the fear just depends upon that. From my perspective, my experience tells me that all these bad things come from ignorance. And that's why I feel it's so important to do what we can to build these relationships. Like this, like everybody here. Doing these things are so important to try and counter that long term.
Thank you, Ryan. It's interesting that the effort that you're leading here with Push Back the Darkness, Ryan, utilizes the same technology that Sister Kathy was referring to that has resulted in a lot of the networks of hatred. So hopefully we can bring networks of positivity, of unity through these efforts, inshallah. And can I invite another question or two from the floor, inshallah? Sister, please come to the front so that everyone can hear you as well as the feed, inshallah. We're online.
It's more of a comment than a question. I just wanted to bring this up. I often feel there's more need to promote the part of our religion which is called Nahi anil Munkar. So there's more focus on Amar bil Ma'ruf in terms of the teachings and everything, because Nahi anil Munkar is more difficult. It's hard to criticize people or to stop the evil. But if this concept is more introduced and taught in a better way how to stop the evil will still be scared. The evil thing is also going to be scared. We are right, but we are scared, right? But evil is very easy to commit evil, and the person who is doing the right, why should the person be scared? So I feel even in masajid there should be some lectures about forbidding the evil, how to do it in a pleasant way in different type of circumstances, and then correlating that with what Sister Samia is saying in terms of different incidences and how you positively do that. I think we need to learn that as well. So that is one thing I wanted to bring up.
Jazakallah khair, Sister, for a pointed question. So the idea of evil in its socialized forms. Sister Kathy, Sister Samia, maybe do you want to try to take that on? I mean, arguably, Sister, without a doubt, we have many members of administration here. We need to have more of these sessions and more of these conversations. Perhaps we can get a comment, Sister Kathy. Sister Samia, maybe? This one.
So when I do training, I use this model that it's a cyclical model that starts from creating awareness, because as Ryan was pointing out and Dr. Kathy was pointing out, sometimes people don't even know that what they're doing is evil or injustice, or that they're causing harm in any way or shape. So starting with that idea of creating awareness, and then making sure that we have space for reflection, for being really, the hardest thing that I think people grapple with is honesty and being honest with themselves. You know, sometimes people can be honest with other people, or they think they might be honest with, but you know, I think the biggest mistake, that this service that we do ourselves, is lying to ourselves. Right? So continuously patting ourselves in the back and saying we're awesome, which is great, and we need it. Sometimes we need that pep talk and positive talk. But also when we actually do harm, it's very, very difficult to sit with ourselves and say, oh my goodness, I messed up. Right? So creating space for people to experience that. I'm not always looking for comfort, not going so quick. Right? There's this practice around silence, and how as a society we continuously feel silence. Right? You're driving, your radio's on, you're like, if Ryan and I were sitting next to each other, we will need to fill that silence. None of us will be more comfortable with silence, because when silence takes place, reflection happens. Your mind starts wandering. So being intentional, whether it's through silence or other practices, creating space for mindfulness and reflection of first of all knowing what the wrong was and what how did I attribute it, what part did I take of it? And then going, like it's not enough to feel bad. And this is often my conversations with folks. It's like, your guilt does nothing, right, for me. Like you feeling bad, alhamdulillah, that's awesome. But, that will not change anything. So there has to be a way to channel that energy afterwards into something tangible and in terms of an action. So if we are able to practice that, I think it might be a useful way to bring people. And honestly speaking, it's very few times that I've ever said this, but there are people that you just can't turn. There are needles that you cannot push. And you just have to be honest with yourself to realize that you are working against someone who fully knows what they're doing, are choosing to be hateful, are doing this intentionally. So we cannot only continue giving people excuses, right? The Prophet ﷺ says, "La يلدغ المؤمن من جحر مرتين," right? A believer is not bit from the same hole twice. So if you've tried this and you've worked with this group of people or per person and you see nothing is happening, use your energy wisely somewhere else. But have that husn al-dhan and purity of intention that this is indeed because of ignorance. This is indeed because they haven't had a chance to learn better. This is indeed because they don't know where to go. But here is all the resource. Here's all the help. Here's how I can be here for you. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair, sister. So the ideas of reflection, inshallah, through training and awareness, mashallah, but then also as a community building our resilience. It's striking what you mentioned earlier, Sister Samia, about white fragility. I wonder if those of us within the postmodern West and the militantly secular West are becoming fragile ourselves. Maybe a lot of these tests and tragedies allow us to galvanize around efforts like Brother Ryan's Push Back the Darkness and try to build resilience, inshallah. Maybe that's part of why this is all happening to us. Can we get any more questions from the floor, inshallah? Sister, please, bismillah.
I think people are leaving, we should wrap it up.
We'll take a last question, inshallah, sister.
Alright,
And,
this is, I guess, more of a comment than a question. Because I grew up in Canada myself, I think when we want to educate people about Islam, I think what they need to see that in what ways does Islam benefit us? Okay, so so that we're not seen as the others. For example, in terms of hijab, because someone who doesn't know the purpose behind hijab, it's just like a piece of cloth you have over your head. Why do you need to wear it? And I think if we bring that correlation that the benefit that modesty and hijab has in society, it's not just for Muslims. It's not the religion of the Arabs or the Asian people, but actually, when you look at the statistics, leading to, for example, if women are not modest in dress, for example, what it leads to, the consequences, men cheating on their wives, being to divorces, single parents, and all that. So to make these sort of correlations so that they can understand that, Islam is not just a religion, but it's a way of life, and there are benefits to it for all of humanity. So if people, are informed about these things, then, people would actually understand it, and they should respect Islam, right? And just because they're informed about the religion, it doesn't mean that they need to convert, but just to see that, it's not just religion, but it's a way of life, and it's beneficial for humanity, for society, and as a whole. So, putting, getting people to be educated I think it is key, and then actually not just talking about it, but actually having tangible programs, realistic goals, and trying to meet that.
Jazakallah khair, sister. Thank you. I couldn't have summarized. I think you took my job away from me for summarizing the afternoon's proceedings, mashallah. Unless any of the commentators want to respond, inshallah, I think we'll continue. I know, brother, you had a question at the back, but we'd like to wrap up. Maybe we can continue the conversation on the floor, inshallah. If we could just finish with the dua. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Jazakallah khair for joining us, inshallah. We'll see you at the next seminar. Have a safe drive home. Assalamu alaikum.